Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today we're going to tackle one of the most iconic bad guys in movie history, the Stormtrooper of the Galactic Empire. Now these guys are your bread and butter if you're playing Star Wars Legion, but there are a bunch of games that have Stormtrooper or Stormtrooper-like figures in them, so this same technique will work as the basis for your Snowtroopers, if you're playing Imperial Assault, anything like this. And funnily enough, Apothecary White, which is kind of the basis of this whole thing, works pretty well on apothecaries and other white power armor. Now this takes minutes to do. I'll talk a little bit about later on how, you can speed it up slightly. Definitely helps if you are batch painting. But without any further mucking around, let's get straight into how to. Now I've chosen to prime the Stormtrooper in Corax White rather than a straight white because the slight blue tint gives us a little more that we can do when we want to come and highlight them. You can work from a pure white if you like, and there are some nice smooth white primers out there. It's really a matter of personal choice at this stage, but this is how I do it. So having given him that, we can then move on to giving him the first layer, which is a contrast color. We're going to use Apothecary White. Now, one thing I want to point out quickly about these contrast things is make sure that you shake them up good and proper, because you'll see there's a lot of sort of sediment at the bottom of the pots here. Some colors you don't have to worry about this too much. They don't collect. There's not much sediment or pigment or whatever it is at the bottom. But with your white, you want to make sure, give it a good shake, all right? You're never going to get all of this off of the bottom, but as much as you can, all right? Make sure that you are really shaking it. I've got an agitator in here, so let's give that a minute or so. Just, very important that you do the sound effects, guys. And then before painting, you're looking for something like this in the bottom of your pot. I find the easiest way to do it if you haven't got an agitator in there is to grip it nice and tight, make sure you're not letting the lid pop off, and shake it upside down, because some of the air bubbles there will help get that stuff off the bottom. But now we can move on to painting. So I've got my Stormtrooper, I've got a nice big brush, and you can use whatever brush you like for this. This is not complicated. All we're doing is coating the entire Stormtrooper in Apothecary White. Use this stuff straight from the pot, and you want to make sure when you come to any recesses, like around the detail on his back here, that you are spending a moment just to make sure that you're getting it into the detail. Sometimes, it can look like it's wet and you've got the color on there, but when it dries, you've got these little gaps where you haven't pushed it into those recesses. So once that's done, give them about half an hour to dry, and then we can go on to the next step. Now we've got a Stormtrooper who is slightly blue. You see, Apothecary White obviously can't be a pure white, but for something like this, it's ideal. It's giving us that neat, kind of mechanical finish to anything underneath. So I've got here some Praxiti White and my small dry brush, and we'll just prep that up. Now with the Stormtroopers, the easiest way to get a good dry brush off of this is to go against these raised panels that they've got. So the ridges in their legs, for example, you're trying to cross detail. Now this will take a little bit of time to sort of get right. You always want to have just a little bit not enough paint on the brush, I should say. Because as always with dry brushing, if you have too much on to start with, it's going to make things go bonk, to put it lightly. But you can go over a few times and build up a color. So what you're doing now is going around the whole model, going against any areas of detail, like on his back here it's nice and simple because it's just along you go. But take your time and brighten up that white with some of this dry brushing highlight. Now after a couple of passes with our Praxiti White, we've got some highlights on our Stormtrooper. And you can see, it's a little difficult with the lighting and of course pure white, but hopefully you can see a little bit of the transition of color. Now what we're going to do when it comes to varnishing this is that's going to smooth that out quite a bit. But what we need to do now is all of the black parts. So I've got here my medium layer brush and I've got some black Templar. And no great surprise what's going to happen here. Just take your time and pop this into any of the joins. Now, as well, while you're doing that, you will find that when you come to the face, you want to go down to a smaller brush. So I've got my small layer brush here too. But while I'm doing all the joins, I'm also going to paint in his gun with this black Templar. So anything that will be black, black Templar, funnily enough. And there our Stormtrooper is finished. If you want to get into the really little bits with a bit of black, you can do that. But we'll get to something in a second. If you do have any oops moments, like I have just here on his back, you can get Corax White in a pot now, which is actually quite handy. Doesn't glug up nearly as much as Ceramite White did. And just thin that out. You can use that to very quickly fill in any little mistakes. And then pretend it's a highlight. Shh. Now, Black Templar does dry with a very slight blue tint, which is kind of hard to see when it's the only black you've got on the miniature. But if you do want to differentiate the gun a little bit from the sort of leathery stuff that he's got, grab yourself some Basilicanum Grey, and you can go over that black again, and that will just very slightly change the tone, so it looks a little more polished metal black. It is entirely up to you whether or not you like the look of that. It's, again, purely optional. If there's any little bits, like on the side of these dealy boppers on his head here, which are normally a sort of a squeaky grey, you can also fill those in with just a dot of Basilicanum Grey just here. Now once that's dry, all that remains is to give them a quick varnish, and I'm going to use Munitor and Varnish Spray for this. What this will help do is obviously seal the miniature, so you're not rubbing off any of this contrast stuff, and on top of that, it will give it a little bit of sort of plastic finish to it, which is great for these Stormtroopers. And with that, our Stormtrooper is finished, ready to drop onto the table and play some games. You can go ahead and blacken his base again, like the Fantasy Flight, you know, those little grey circles they've got going. But I like to base mine to sort of match a certain terrain. Now, Tatooine is a good old standby, so I've got here, this is some XV88. And what I'm going to do is paint over the top of the base with this first of all to lay down kind of a base coat. And you'll see why in a couple of seconds here. Now once this had time to dry, I'm going to apply some Agrellan Earth out of the pot, and this is that weird, crackly, dirty stuff. Now the reason why we've laid down the sort of sandy colour first is once this crackles, it's going to show us what's underneath. You know, we're going to see the base again. So if it's just that flat, boring white, it's going to look a little peculiar. Now this stuff works better the more of it you can sort of pile on. You don't want to go crazy with your basic infantry, but little pockets, little blobs and what have you, just take your time. And you want a couple of millimeters of this all around the base. Then leave it in the sun somewhere. If you haven't got the sun, of course, you'll have to just be a little more patient. You can leave these overnight. The longer you leave this, the more pronounced the crackle effect will become. So I'm going to load this stuff up and then pop it in the sun because it's approximately 8 billion degrees right now. Now once it's had plenty of time to dry, you get this cool crackling effect. And this is why it's important to have a colour underneath, because you see, you might make out some of that yellowy sort of colour underneath. Now you can leave it like this, but what I've got here is some Agaros dunes, and we're going to paint this over the top of all of that crackled earth. It's going to give us a slightly better sort of desert effect. Now this will look quite rough going on, but as with always, you want to keep the faith and just finish off the whole thing. So plonk down a layer of Agaros dunes and then give it about 10-20 minutes to dry. And from there, just a little bit of Tyrant Skull on your small dry brush. And remember, too little is always better than too much. All we're looking to do is catch the sort of raised edges of those crackly bits and introduce a bit of depth to the base there. And that's going to look real cool. And there we have it. Our Stormtrooper is complete, ready to hunt out the rebellion against the Empire and mercilessly crush them. If he can hit, that is. Now this is a lightning fast method for getting out tons of Stormtroopers, and while it's not perfect, I reckon it looks pretty bleeding close, you know. It does the job, and though drying time is kind of the slow point, actual painting time on these is next to nothing. So if you queue up a bunch of them at once, you know, paint in batches of, what do you get, 6 in a box? 6 or 7? Paint them all at once, and you'll notice this just flies by. So, as always, guys, feel free to drop a comment in the old box below. My Twitter and Facebook are both linked there too. Thank you very much for your time, and you guys enjoy the rest of your day.